I believe I've discovered a conflict between the moral argument for the existence of God and both the contingency argument and the design argument, and that this results in a tangible way to demonstrate how parts of theistic ethical systems are inherently and inescapably subjective. Now, I've made videos countering the moral argument in the past, pointing out that a theistic grounding of moral values in God's nature is inherently subjective by definition. This is because philosophers and apologists define objectivity as being mind independent. And if God's nature grounds in moral values, and God is understood to be a disembodied mind, then the nature of a mind is by definition dependent on a mind. Now, I still think this objection works and is useful, but it's still semantic in nature. Atheists can do better to show how a number of moral obligations that theists want to impose on society are inherently and inescapably subjective, not objective in nature. First, let's define objective when talking about objective moral values and duties. Instead of being mind independence, let's say that objectivity is stance independence, meaning that a moral duty is objective only if it is not dependent on what an individual subjectively thinks about what should be the case on any given moral question. I believe this definition is a steel man for theistic moral arguments, since it stands a better chance of avoiding the semantic argument I described previously. Now, I think the reason theists don't use this definition from the start is that this kind of objectivity is much easier to achieve a non-theistic objective moral system. Next, let's look at how theists ground moral values, specifically in God's nature. For the sake of argument, we can accept this, but there's a particular problem for the theist. While God's nature can arguably ground the goodness of being, say, loving or truthful, there are quite a few moral questions that quite literally can't be grounded in God's nature. For instance, God is a disembodied mind, not an embodied physical agent. This means God's necessary nature has no biological sex, nor any kind of sexual function or drive. In fact, as apologists like to tell us when giving the design argument, God had to quite literally design the concept of biological sex, along with all the other intricate factors going into making up not just human biology, but the entire physical universe. This actually has some important consequences, namely that God's nature necessarily cannot ground quite a few values or obligations as it relates to sexual conduct. There may be other areas of morality where we can apply this problem, but I think sexual ethics is the paradigmatic example of the issue. Now let's consider a few examples of how this problem applies. Consider the widely held theistic view that the whole variety of homosexual sex acts are immoral, to the point where we have a moral obligation to not engage in any of them. Why exactly is this wrong? Different theistic moral systems may answer the question differently, but we know it can't be because of anything inherent in God's necessary nature, as we've covered. Now, a modified divine command theorist can only go with two options. Option one is that God just doesn't want humans to engage in that kind of sexual activity, and so commands us not to. Or option two, God designed sexual activity to be only between a man and a woman for the purposes of creating children, and homosexual acts go against God's design, and so God commands us not to engage in those acts. Now, both of these options have problems, because either case entails God having a stance on how sexual activity is to be conducted. The first option is the most obviously subjective, because simply God doesn't like that kind of act, even though he made it possible. Now, the second option is really just as problematic, because in order for God to have a design for sexual activity, God has to have a stance on how sexual activity is to work in the first place. There is no design or purpose without intent, which entails God having a stance on how sexual activity is supposed to work. This problem applies equally to theists who will appeal to natural law theory in order to ground their ethics, because in order for there to be a purpose or natural end to sexual activity, God necessarily has to have a stance on what the purpose was for when he created it. This means that natural law theory has a problem for just about anything it wants to do, because God determined the purposes and proper function of, well, everything about us. According to natural law theory, the penis is supposed to climax in the vagina, not in the mouth, not in the hand, not between the breasts, or in an asshole. Now, that's necessarily a stance God had to take on how sexual function is to work, meaning any prohibitions against those actions are necessarily stance dependent. Now, to better highlight how these prohibitions are dependent on God's stances, God not only has to have a stance on how sexuality is supposed to work, but he also has to specifically intend that performing these non intended actions is wrong and not merely permissible. Let's consider a parallel for consuming alcohol. God determined how our biology would work and how alcohol specifically would affect us. There's an old joke I liked when I was a theist. Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. Now, given that alcohol consumption is as part of a celebratory activity is endorsed as permissible in the Bible, with the story of Jesus turning water into wine at a wedding party being very informative here. So, looking at the story, having moderate amounts of alcohol is permitted, but in other parts of the Bible, drunkenness is condemned. The line on what is permitted and what is immoral with respect to drinking is dependent on God's stance, because it is not as if God can get a buzz or become drunk, and there isn't really a blanket prohibition on alcohol consumption simpliciter like in Christianity or Judaism at least. So God has a subjective line on what is permissible and impermissible, and he drew a line somewhere. Now, I am arguing that it is the same way with sexual functions. It is not as if theists believe that these other sexual acts are inherently permitted or are morally neutral acts that are possible side effects of God's intended design. No, what theists want to tell us is that these acts are specifically prohibited, and they only can be grounded as wrong because God has a stance on the matter on how we engage in sexual activity. Now, as I've alluded to, these problems don't only apply to homosexual acts. It applies to the rules and obligations put on straight sexual relations just as well. In fact, the problem gets worse and even more stance dependent the further we go in looking at common theistic sexual ethics. Even under natural law ethics, the most that it could demonstrate is that only in penis in vagina sex is the only kind of permissible sex, at least as it relates to the completion for the male. However, most religions prohibit sexual relations unless the people involved are married. But what exactly grounds the wrongness of sex outside of marriage? It can't be because of something grounded in God's nature, because God is not a sexual being, nor does God necessarily have a spouse. And it also cannot be because marriage between one man and one woman is the best way to rear children, and this is for two reasons. First, polygamy, which is one man with many women, either all wives or some concubines, was very common in early human history and is specifically permitted and regulated in many religions, including Christianity, and that did provide for the rearing of children. And second is that there are many examples throughout history of couples cohabitating and rearing children outside of marriage. Now, the only thing theists can appeal to here is that God commands that we not engage in sex outside of marriage because he intended that we only perform sexual acts he designed inside of that social construct. Now, that is necessarily a stance-dependent view. To highlight this even further, notice how relativism sneaks into Christian and Jewish ethics when we look no further than polygamy. Not only was it permitted and regulated in the Old Testament, but we have a case where Yahweh endorses the practice in 2 Samuel 12:8, where it is revealed that God gave King David his master's wives, plural, where the verse then continues to list other things given to David, and it said that if that somehow wasn't enough for David, God would have given him more. The implication that God would have just given him more wives if the, 8 he had was not enough. So I think I can make a further point here about the subjectivity and relativism of Christian ethics between the Old and New Testaments as it relates to marriage and divorce laws, but what I really want to point out is an overlooked fact. In the Old Testament, polygamy was permitted, but polyandry, where a wife has more than one husband, was not. Again, this is a completely subjective call by God, in that it was just his stance on the matter of what kind of multi-person relationship was permitted and what was not. A theist might object that due to the nature of sexual reproduction, it makes sense for a man to have multiple wives to create as many children as possible, where a singular wife with multiple husbands cannot do the same thing. Now, the problem with that response is who designed the sexual system to work that way in the first place? What we have here is an undeniably stance-dependent design choice by God. Now, I can make similar arguments about a variety of other Old Testament laws regarding sexuality. Notice how a wife is to be stoned to death if the husband finds she is not a virgin on their wedding night, but not the man, or why a woman is considered unclean after birth for twice as long if she has a female child instead of a male, or how a man is first to marry a woman that he has raped, but not the other way around. Ironically, how is it that the rapist couldn't then stone the wife, knowing as he does that she's not a virgin after they're married? Now, it's not as if it's logically impossible for created beings to have a single gender or none, where either person could be involved in the gestation of a child. The possibilities are quite vast here. In fact, we could have been an asexual species instead, which ironically would have been more in line with being made in God's image, as God certainly has no sexual identity or organs as part of his necessary nature. Now, before closing, I want to address a potential objection. One particularly entertaining objection came from Twitter when I was developing this argument, where a Christian tried to escape the conclusion by claiming that human nature is a necessary fact. They claim that humans are necessarily sexual beings that just so happen to work in a specific way, and that when God created the universe, he merely chose to make us human instead of what other potentially infinite amount of possible created beings he could have made us. Now, this view then saves the theist from having to admit that God took a variety of stances on how our sexual organs were to be used. As an aside, I do wonder if these same theists would have to admit that, say, Ferengi nature is also a possible necessary truth, and in some other possible world, this video would have been about the nature of the permissibility of umox. And if you don't get that reference, go look up Star Trek. Now, this objection runs into the problem of what exactly grounds the necessary truth of the facts of human nature. It strikes me as yet another case of theists drawing a neat little circle around some set of facts and then calling it necessary when it's convenient for their theology. Now still, being wildly implausible doesn't mean it's inherently wrong, though it would reduce the prior probability of any specific brand of theism that needs to take on such an esoteric view. The second problem with this view is that any theist who takes it must now abandon just about any argument from design. After all, if human nature is a necessary fact, then so too could be the laws of nature. In fact, I don't see any way for the theist to draw a distinction on what seemingly contingent facts now get to be considered necessary ones. The third problem is that the theist who takes this view on now has to give up any facet of the design argument, because the entire point of the objection is to avoid God having to take any stances on how human sexuality is to function, which means that he couldn't have designed our biology. I'm actually pretty confident this probably ends up contradicting Christian and Jewish scriptures, but I really don't want to dig that deep to develop an argument here. This is because the fourth and most fatal problem with this objection is that even if we grant such an esoteric and implausible view, it doesn't save the theist from my argument. This is because while it would arguably save them from God having to take stances on how our sexual organs were to be used, it doesn't account for why straight sexual relations are only permitted inside the social construct of marriage, or why polygamy was permitted instead of polyandry. Now, another interesting facet of this is that because all these supposed moral rules about sexuality, if they are real, are inherently subjective moral facts and duties, we can then turn this into an argument for atheism. Consider what is more likely, that a creator God decided to create a number of subjective moral values and duties as it relates to the sexual function of humans, or that these rules were simply formulated as a biological adaptation, a part of our evolutionary development to help ensure the proliferation of our species. In fact, many of the sexual rules we've looked at aren't even based on creating more children, but instead are related to enforcing a kind of male-dominated patriarchal society. To my eyes, it is abundantly clear that some of the most heinous parts of the Old Testament sexual ethics are really just trying to encode a patriarchal society into supposedly moral laws. We would expect such a system under atheism, where sexuality emerged as part of evolution and natural selection, but it is particularly odd under theism, where this is all part of the designs of a perfectly good and all-loving God. In conclusion, this argument illustrates how the most controversial parts of theistic moral systems are inherently and inescapably subjective. It is a particularly entertaining conclusion because many theists in our contemporary discourse about sexuality and LGBTQ rights will insist that we cannot permit any kinds of the sexual acts that I discussed in this video because of a particular chain of logic. Premise 1, morality is objective and binds us all. Premise 2, morality can only be objective if God exists. Premise 3, their specific religion is true. And Premise 4, in that religion, God commands that these sexual acts be forbidden. To see that if there is a moral prohibition on a variety of sexual acts described in this argument, then if it is based on theism, then those prohibitions are inherently arbitrary and subjective. This entails a contradiction in the chain of logic that they appeal to in order to enforce their moral system on a society. And with that, I'd like to say thanks for watching.